Whatever the specifics, the results were sure to be very good and very long-lasting. As the sole superpower, that phrase gained currency, America stood in solitary splendor, recognized by all as the indispensable nation, able to discern even as it simultaneously embodied the right side of history. Now, my text encloses all those phrases in quotes, indicating irony and disapproval. But during the 1990s, ostensibly serious people making such claims did not intend them to be ironic. They were merely reciting what had in fact become the conventional wisdom. And as well they might. Expanding on or embroidering on such themes, got your books on bestseller lists and your columns and all the best newspapers and your smiling face on the Sunday morning talk shows. My favorite artifact of this period, this post-Cold War era, remains the New York Times Magazine dated March 28, 1999. The cover story excerpted the Lexus and the olive tree, Tom Friedman's just-released celebration of globalization as Americanization. The cover, I carry this with me wherever I go. It's my favorite artifact of the era. The cover purported to illustrate what the world needs now, and alongside this photograph of a clenched fist adorned with these stars and stripes in brilliant red, white, and blue appears this text down in the bottom right-hand corner, which you cannot read. You'll have to take my word for what it says. And what it says is the following. For globalism to work, America can't be afraid to act like the almighty superpower that it is. This is the New York Times. This is not the Weekly Standard. This is not the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Well, more or less overlooked amidst all this triumphalism was the fact that that other 20th century, the one in which promoting freedom had never figured as a priority, well, that 20th century continued without interruption. In Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the West Bank, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, the collapse of communism did not qualify as a cosmic event. In such places, the competition to dominate Eurasia had been a sideshow, not the main event, a nuisance. So the remarkable developments of 1989 notwithstanding, the long 20th century continued apace, drawing the almighty superpower ever more deeply into what was fast becoming one hell of a mess. For those with a taste for irony, try this one. 1991 was the year that the USSR finally gave up the ghost. It was also the year of the first Persian Gulf War. One headache went away, another was about to become a migraine. In making the case for war against Iraq, you will recall, George Herbert Walker Bush depicted Saddam Hussein as a Hitler-like menace. Neither the first nor the last time the infamous Führer would play a walk-on role in climes far removed from Germany. Indeed, Adolf Hitler has enjoyed an impressive second career as a sort of stunt double for Middle East films. Recall that back in 1956, to justify the reckless Anglo-French-Israeli assault on Egypt, Prime Minister Anthony Eden had fingered Colonel Nasser as another Hitler. Just a few months ago, Senator Lindsey Graham, the hawkish Republican senator from South Carolina, likened Libya's Muammar Gaddafi to the Nazi leader. More recently still, the journalist Max Boot, who has made a career out of promoting wars, found Hitler's spirit lurking in present-day Iran. However absurd such comparisons, and they are absurd, the Nazi dictator's periodic guest appearances makes an important point. They illustrate the persistent Western disinclination to see the struggle for the greater Middle East, that's the long 20th century narrative, to see that on its own terms. Instead, to explain developments there, Western leaders import cliches or stock figures ripped from the more familiar and, from their perspective, the more reassuring short 20th century. But in doing so, they confuse themselves and they confuse us. Alas, the elder Bush's effort to eliminate his Hitler back in 1991 came up short. Celebrated in its day as a great victory, Operation Desert Storm turned out to be anything but that. The First Persian Gulf War deserves to be remembered chiefly as a source of wildly inflated and pernicious illusions. More than any other event, this brief conflict persuaded Washington, now freed of constraints imposed by the Cold War, that the application of U.S. military power held the key to reordering the greater Middle East in ways likely to serve American interests. Here it seemed, in Operation Desert Storm, here it seemed, was evidence that war still worked. And work handsomely. Flexing U.S. military muscle on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific had once made America stronger and the world a better place. Why not count on American power to achieve similar results in the Persian Gulf and Central Asia? Why not take the means that had seemingly brought the short 20th century to such a happy conclusion and apply those means to the problems of the greater Middle East? Throughout the 1990s, neoconservatives and other jingoists vigorously promoted this view. And after 9/11, George W. Bush made it his own. So in explaining what had happened on September 11, 2001, and in explaining what needed to happen next, President Bush appropriated precepts from the short 20th century. It was going to be World War II all over again. We have seen their kind before, the president said of the terrorists who had assaulted America. The occasion was an address before a joint session of Congress, barely more than a week after the attack on the World Trade Center in the Pentagon. They're the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century, the president continued. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they will follow the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. And they will follow the path all the way to where it ends in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies. Lest there be any doubt of where Bush was situating himself and the country historically, he made a point of warmly welcoming the British Prime Minister to the proceedings. America has no truer friend than Great Britain, the President declared, adding that, quote, once again we are joined together in a great cause. The implications were clear. The partnership of Tony and George revived the tradition of Winston and Franklin and of Maggie and Ron. Good, once again, stood firm against evil. And I have to say, from his vantage point, in the great beyond, Churchill must have lit a cigar and poured himself a brandy. Imagine his gratitude to President Bush for overlooking the role that he and his countrymen had played in bollocksing up the greater Middle East in the first place. Because in reality, during the long 20th century, the United States had only intermittently viewed Great Britain as a friend. Perfidious Albion had instead been a recurring source of rapacious tomfoolery, making a mess of things and then walking away once staying on had become inconvenient. The former British mandate for Palestine offering one notable example. Even so, many gullible or perhaps cynical observers endorsed President Bush's interpretation. September 2001 became December 1941 all over again. Once again, World War II, unwelcome or inconvenient details excluded as always, was pressed into service as a moral memory palace. As the bellicose authors of a great agitprop classic published in 2004, I'm talking about Richard Pearl and David Frum, as they put it in their book, quote, "There is no middle way for Americans. It is victory or Holocaust." And so a new crusade, preposterously dubbed World War IV in some quarters, commenced. Well, we gather here more than a decade later. Although President Bush is gone, the war he declared continues. Once commonly referred to as a global war on terror, World War IV never really caught on. Today, we hardly know what to call the enterprise in which we are enmeshed. Bush's attempt to graft the putative rationale for war during the short 20th century onto the new wars of the greater Middle East also didn't take. His freedom agenda withered and died. Even so, with President Bush's successor closing down some fronts and ratcheting up others, while opening up brand new fronts in places like Pakistan, Yemen, and Libya, the conflict that Bush began persists.